Okay, thank you, Michelle, and I appreciate the Ellis County Museum hosting and for all of you coming out this evening for my book talk on baseball photography of the Deadball Era. And the first question I always get is, what in the world is the Deadball Era? Most baseball fans don't even know exactly what that is. And I can define it for you in terms of a timeline. It is roughly 1900 to 1920, the first 2 decades of the 20th century. But probably even more importantly is what was happening. It was a very important period in the development of the modern baseball game. One of the reasons they call it dead ball is the ball itself. They may use just 2 or 3 baseballs or maybe 1 baseball for the entire 9-inning game. And as you can imagine, as that ball gets beat around, it turns to mush. Think of it in terms of a tennis ball. And if you were to play a 5-set match with 1 tennis ball, what's going to happen to that ball? It's going to be dead by the end of the match. Same thing with baseball. You know, in the 1910s, a home run leader such as Home Run Baker may hit 11 home runs in 1911, whereas by the 1920s, when Babe Ruth was in his ascendancy, you know, he hit the record 60. So a 5-fold magnitude increase in what introduced really is what is considered the live ball era, which we are still playing in. As I said, the dead ball era was just a critical time in the formation of the modern baseball game. I'd say there's more changes in those 20 years than there were in any other period in the development of baseball from the mid-1800s on. And here I'll just walk you through. Up in the top left corner, there's a baseball. See the red and blue stitching? That was an official American League ball from the dead ball era. The American League was formed in 1901, right at the start of the era, and the American League and the National League are still the 2 leagues that are playing here today, you know, 120 some odd years later. So that was the formation of the 2 leagues. Also, in about 1901 is when they introduced the current configuration of home plate. And if you look, the back end forms a V. That's the foul lines. You know, that's kind of foul territory, fair territory, starting right there, you know, going all the way through to third base and first base. Another thing is that baseball, after emerging from the 1800s, was still played in small wooden structures. For example, this is South End grounds in Boston. That's just a grandstand, you know, facade. If you notice, there are no outfield walls in a lot of these ballparks. The ball would just roll, you know, rather than clearing the fence. That's more of a modern conception of the ball clearing the fence that started during the dead ball era. You can see this photo here. There is no fence. Now, some parks did, but this one didn't. Also, in 1903, that is when the World Series started up. And here is a program from 1903, from the very first World Series. So if you think about it, steel and concrete stadiums such as Wrigley Field and Fenway, which are still in existence, were built in 1912 and I believe 1914. So those were the then modern stadiums that, you know, they had a problem with stadiums burning down with the wooden structures. So they moved to the concrete and steel. Plus that lets you build a much larger facility. Instead of hosting 5 or 10,000, you could get 20, 30,000, you know, into stadiums with the growth of the game. Just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, and this shows in 1901 where the teams are, the black being the National League, white, the American League, and then the cross dots where they had both. And if you look at it, these were all, if you didn't live in the Northeast or the Midwest in a major city, you weren't attending a Major League Baseball game. Everyone else in the rest of the country really did not have access. So it was still very much a regional, you know, game. And people would follow in the newspapers, but the newspapers just really had print stories. In the late 1800s, it was an exceptional thing. You know, maybe the war in Cuba or the war with Spain, maybe that would merit a picture on the front page. But it would take an exceptional world event for them to have true photographs. It was fairly uncommon, you know, in the 1890s. In fact, here's 2 famous newspapers, the Sporting News, which in some incarnation still exists, but that's a 1900 one, and that is on the left, and the dot doesn't really work, but right here, this is how you would see players in the newspaper. And that's what they call a woodcut. They would actually take a piece of wood, and they'd take the picture, etch it in, and then they'd stamp it and have the ridges, and they'd turn it into the printing plate. So that, you know, Does that look like a baseball player to you? Do you think that would romanticize the game or inspire a kid? Does that guy look like he's going to become your idol? I don't think so. You know, the other thing that you had in the 1890s, and this is Sporting Life, which was another major sporting magazine of the time, and that's Wee Willie Keeler. You may have heard of him, a Hall of Famer. But a lot of the photos were taken in studios in street clothes. They put on their best Sunday best. They come to the photographer's studio. They put them up against a background or a potted plant, and they'd snap them. Once again, do you think baseball player when you see this photo and this man? No, you probably don't. Point being that in 1900, most baseball stars were relatively invisible to the average fan if you didn't live in one of those big cities and go to the games and see them in person. You know, around the nation, it really became the national game during this period. And I'll tell you that photography was one of the main reasons why. Just to tell you how scarce photographs, and this probably holds for news photographs as well as baseball photographs, because baseball was just one aspect of the news. But if you use a baseline of saying that if there were 100 photos, for every 100 photos still existing taken in the 1920s and used in newspapers, from 1900 to 1905, there's probably only one remaining. From 1906 to 1910, 2. By 1911 and 1920, in the second decade, it had gone up to 20. So you can see the growth starting to take off. And by the 20s and later, it goes 100 and even more. So it's this explosive growth. You really were watching not only the birth of the modern baseball game, you were watching the birth of press photography and the modern newspapers as we know them. So people say, well, why photographs? I mean, how many of you collected baseball cards as kids? See, most men in here did. I did too. Always enjoyed them. How many of you collect baseball photographs? Almost no one. And the reason why is because these were all working press photographs that were in the archives of newspapers. And it's really only the last 30 years that this hobby has even been created, when they started to digitize and then they would deaccession their collections. And so that those photos kind of entered the hobby, entered the auctions more in the last 30 years. So that's why on those deadball photos, there's so few. A lot of these photos you'll see here tonight are one of a kind. And there's certainly not more than 10 copies of them in existence, period. So it's a thin hobby. You know, there's not many people that collect because quite honestly, not that many can because there's just not the resources to be collected, whereas baseball cards, there's millions, even from the 1900s. Those are all over the place. But why photographs in particular? And I suppose I realize that I don't collect just the photographs, I collect knowledge. I love figuring things out. I like looking at it and seeing what's depicted. And a lot of times on the back of these photos, it'll say the player's name. Sometimes it doesn't, but it doesn't give you any context. Usually, you have to kind of try to decipher what's going on. Here is a 1914 Cracker Jack baseball card that you would have gotten a package of Cracker Jack of Walter Johnson. Beautiful image. I mean, it has the red, the green. Every little boy that would collect this card daydreams about being a baseball player. You know, it puts you in the mindset. Look at this. This is a photo by Francis Burke, who is my favorite baseball photographer, that they used to create that. And I can look at this photo and I can tell you that the year based on the uniform, I can tell you because I can look up here of these cutouts, I can tell you that that's Chicago where the White Sox played. I can identify the stadium and, you know, the stamp on back saying Francis Burke, so I know the photographer, Burke. But to me, cards are a beautiful daydream for every little boy. Photographs are a time machine. They can actually transport you back. Here on the one on the right, you feel like you're on the field in Comiskey Park in about 1910, or 1912, watching Walter Johnson pitch. But just figuring out what's going on there is just what's fascinating to me. Let me give you an example. And I know some of you have seen this and you know what it is, but if you didn't know what it is ahead of time, would you have any idea what this depicts? I didn't. When I bought it off eBay, it's a real photo postcard, so it's a real photo printed on postcard stock. On the back, it just says Boston, Fenway Park, 1914. So that's pretty obvious. I mean, you can see the green monster here. You can even see the sloped field. See how the line kind of slopes? That was a hill kind of going up the wall there. And you can tell, I mean, I know from looking at it, the kind of girders on the stadium there, that's classic Fenway. You know, it's very clear that's what it is. But the key to figuring out what it really is a scoreboard. And you can blow this up under magnification, and you can read all the teams, and then cross-reference it, and you can look at box scores and schedules, and you can figure out there's only so many dates that those teams played each other, and you can figure out the year, you can figure the possible games. And then if you go even further, that says P and C, that's pitcher and catcher. But they didn't have numbers on the jerseys at that point in time. But if you bought a program, it'll give you a number. It's an electronic, they call it an electronic scoreboard, because you'd look up there and see number, 171, and you look in the program and it'd say 171 in the player's name, so you could identify them. So, by chance, I had a friend that had a photo from the same game, two more with shadows, that listed all the pitchers. So I was able to get in touch with the Hall of Fame, and they had a program from this particular game, and I was able to match it and say, and Forbes magazine wrote about it, Sabre wrote about it, identifying. But what you're actually seeing is this ant-sized person is Babe Ruth on the mound in his second ever major league game, and this is the only known original photo of him in the majors from 1914. He only played in 6 games, including one on July 16th, 1914 at Fenway Park. So for me, I just fascinated digging in and doing the discovery and making all the connections and writing it up. And that story is written up in the book, of the whole thing of how I figured out what that was and how I was able to get it authenticated and proven what it is. So for me, that's the challenge and the interest of collecting photographs rather than baseball cards. This is another example. This photo, when I bought it, I knew it was of Chicago, but I couldn't establish what, because I had never seen this image before. What this is this is the West Side grounds in Chicago, which was before Wrigley Field with the Cubs, and this is from 1900. And we know that because if you look here, the flagpole right there and there, that's the home and the visiting clubhouse. They're about 600 feet out in the outfield, and they're in the field of play. And there was never any known photos. I always read the stories of the clubhouses. There's one classic story from 1896 when Hall of Famer Ed Delahunty hit 4 home runs in a game. Now, not all of them cleared the fence. You can see there is fences there, but a lot of them would just roll, the distance. And the classic story is that after he hit 3, the Cubs outfielder retreated back to the flagpole and waved and said, "Okay, I'm ready." And Delahunty hit another home run anyway. They just couldn't stop him that day. But it's also fascinating that there were no dugouts in that point in time. That's literally a bench that the players are sitting on there. And that's a snapshot taken by likely a fan, sitting back in the crowd taking a vista. And there's another shot that's not quite as interesting that I have from that same game. But to me, that's the interesting and the challenge of what is it figuring out and proving to, and experts review all this and say, yes, we 100% agree that that's what that is. Okay, so this is a photo from the Detroit Tigers' first ever baseball game in 1901. That's their home opener against the Milwaukee Brewers. In fact, they hadn't quite finished the stadium. If you notice, the rafters are exposed still at the end of the stadium. But this also shot gives you a good limitation of the photography technology. They did have cameras that could do action shots, but they were few and far between. The average photographer, if you look how blurry the photos are, they just didn't have the shutter speed and the technology to be able to do the stop action photography. And that's one reason that from the 1890s, most of the photographs are in the studio. You had controlled conditions. You could sit there for a couple of minutes, frozen solid, to get a portrait photographer done. So that's kind of just an interesting opening of baseball. This is Fenway Park in 1912 from the first World Series. And I told you about that explosive growth of photographers on the field. This is on the roof of Fenway. And there's another gaggle of them on the other side that extends out like that. But can you imagine today's and the liability of letting photographers get on the roof of Fenway right now? The police would be tackling you if you tried something like that now. But it's fascinating just to see the sheer numbers. And the other fascinating thing is that most of these photographers remain anonymous. I'm going to run through some of the famous photographers and a few of the important minor ones, but I'd say 90% plus of the photographs, we have no idea who the man and at that point it was all men doing the photography, you know, of who that person was that snapped it. We may know which news organization that they worked for. They'd stamp that, you know, with Underwood or American Press Association or something like that, but we have no idea who the person was. This is how they went about creating the photographs in that day of time. And this was a revolutionary camera called the Graflex. And you can see the young photographer looking down the view scope, and that resulted in what they call the heroic pose. A lot of times they stand like this, or sometimes they stand and balance it on their knee to be able to do that, looking up at the player. And that's an actual photograph. That's the photograph that that man was taking. He was working for the Bain News Service, and another photographer snapped him snapping the picture. But you can put two and two together and figure out that that's the resulting image of how it was done. And off that, they used glass plate negatives. Usually, this was a Bain photographer, and these were usually 4x5 glass plates, and they would press it. And that's an original, I have that original glass plate from the 1911 World Series. That's Chief Bender at the Polo Grounds in New York. And you can tell it's Polo Grounds because you know that facade. I can identify that as where it is, and they were in different leagues, so it had to be the World Series, even though it doesn't have a date on it, because that's the only time those teams would have played. And there's an original print that was printed in 1911 off that negative. I mean, I have the negative, I could still print a copy, but it's not going to have the patina and the sheen and the sepia qualities of those. And really, that raises another issue. Collectors as book collectors like first editions, first printings. Photo collectors like one printed as close in point in time to the was original was snapped. You know, the one snapped there is much more interesting, much more valuable than one that I print off tomorrow. These also, as I mentioned, were not really released to the public. These were working work of arts that they would send these off in the mail to the various newspapers and the publications. And for example, this original photo by the International Press, they would apply this masking. And a little of it's been erased to show you that it's masking and not in the photo itself. But that piece right there was actually used to produce this 1912 or 1911 Police Gazette supplement. You can just see the masking of how it mirrors in there. So these were very much, and this was in an archive probably till the 1990s when it got released and into the market. The photographers we mentioned, these are, and this is in the book, this is the end papers of the book. And these are the photographers' stamps that they would use to basically claim their photos. They'd almost always put these on the back of their photograph, and it served two purposes. One, they wanted to be able to get the credit. See, it says credit Brown Brothers. That's very important. When they published it in the papers, you wanted to say photo by Brown Brothers underneath it in the caption. Also, if you notice, some of them, like Charles Conlon, has an address. They'd really like it if you sent the photo back to them so they could use it again. Although most of the photo services just kept them and put them in their file, and the next time they had a picture of that player come up, they just went to their file and pull it out, didn't have to pay the photographer again for the use of the image. So those are kind of their calling cards, and that's kind of one way that we know who took the photos or which organization and how we can place the time. For example, I can do the research, and on the Paul Thompson Agency, you know, if you say here, that says 1910s, that says circa 1909 because it has an 09 penciled in. So you can tell that these are original prints by knowing when the photographer moved. They changed their address. Because if you think about it, if you moved and you wanted the photo returned, you're not going to use an old address. You're going to put the new address on there so you have the maximized chances. But in hindsight, as kind of archaeologists, it lets us go back in and say, if you see this stamp, it's almost a guarantee it was printed circa 1910 and it's an original photo. So it's very helpful to us, very different purpose than what they used it for back in the day. Let me just walk you through some of the famous photographers. You probably haven't heard of most of these men, but you know, within the photography and baseball collecting, they're all pretty well known. First one I'll mention is Carl Horner, and I mention him because he was really a bridge from the 1890s into the modern photography. He has, and this is the back of one of his cabinet cards, and cabinet cards were really used predominantly in the 1890s, but he claims to be from Stockholm, Sweden, and you know, he claims in other advertising to be a European photographer. And by European, he means not just literally that he came from Europe, but the European old master style. And that's a photo of him. That's the only image of him that we have on a cabinet card that he was posing with his wife that I've cropped there. But here's his work, a very representative. Serious photographer fans, say this guy is just your average school photographer who happens to be famous because a lot of his images were used for the baseball cards. And there's some truth to that. But there's no denying he looked gorgeous. So this is Walter Johnson as a young player. Look how angelic that photo is. And he was in Boston, which had the American and National League, which means that all the players in the majors would cycle through Boston, and he'd have them come, sometimes in street clothes, sometimes in their uniform, to take studio portraits. And there's a cabinet card that was issued, using that. As I say, he was a bridge. Here's why. This is the same baseball player, Red Doohan. On the left, this one is taken by Carl Horner. It's the photo you send home to mom. He's got the little Mona Lisa smile. He's got the perfectly manicured uniform. It's all neat and trim. And Horner, actually, for the vanity, he went through, and I've seen the original negative for that. He took a little pen and he blotted out every single freckle so that it would show up as a clean face. So that's from the early 1900s. Same player, shot in about 1910 by Paul Thompson's agency on the field. And look at the grit on the cap. You can see he has different colored eyes. You see the freckles. You see the stare. Totally different, grittier, more modern. Even though these are taken within 10 years of each other, there are a world of difference between the two of them. And this looks modern to us when you see this. You say, okay, I could recognize that player on the field. Whereas the guy on the left, he looks like a bygone era. So this was a sea change. Horner was kind of the bridge. Like I say, he's not as well respected among serious hobbyists just because of the quality of photography is not quite as high. Another innovator was George Grantham Bain. He wasn't an actual photographer, but he started what was perhaps the first news photography agency, right around the turn of the century. By the late 1908, he's churning out a lot of baseball photos. He very much distinguished-looking man, but he was kind of think of him as Rupert Murdoch, or he was a media titan, that he would get the photos and distribute them out, would hire a fleet of young photographers. He was also very innovative, and he had what he called an auto printer, that he had this standardized 4x5 glass plate negatives. He had this little replication machine that let his workers produce high quality contact prints, directly on the paper, very fast. So he kind of broad business, sending it all over the nation. He needed to be able to print a mass, and he couldn't do it or didn't want the photographer to do it, but he could have just an office staff print them. So he made inventions to be able to do that. But he is known, his style of his agency is broad sweeping vistas, and then also close up and almost haunting lyrical images of this is Walter Johnson at the dugout. And as you see, this has been cleaned up a little bit, but a working, press photo, you can still see a little bit of the tag, coming through. But very different feel from the Carl Horner, more posed studio. One of my personal favorites is Francis Burke, who was a Chicago photographer, and he was in partnership with Harry Atwell, but Atwell took the circus and the theater photos. He took all the baseball photos. But he was not only just a baseball photographer, but he was also, if you're familiar with photography and you think of, say, Lewis Hine and some of the social photographs, he took, I've seen a magazine with many of his images, and these are poor orphan children, and he literally photographs them behind the bars. But that sense of desperation and the plight, and if you see it on a larger scale, it's just crystal clear, and the empathy that he'll show and just the photography skills of capturing those images. And I think he kind of carries that forward to baseball. This is 1912 Red Sox World Championship at Comiskey Park once again, and if you saw the live photo, you can tell the light streaming in a little bit more, the team with a kind of nonchalant feel. The hot dog vendor with the basket, right up there, perched in the background. So he could frame the layers of the photograph. You see the team, you see the hot dog, you see the light streaming in. Just kind of a master. He was also a master of just capturing motion, as opposed to like Horner, who did studio. But that's Home Run Baker, Chief Bender, and Ty Cobb on the left. And all these were used for baseball cards of that era. Like I say, he was a master of just fluidity and grace. And if you see him, doesn't translate as well to the screen, but just the richness of it when you see the original prints in hand. And they are very scarce. There's probably not more than 50 of his prints that still are in existence. Probably the most famous photographer, baseball photographer, not only of the Deadball era, but of all time, is Charles M. Conlon, and that's him about 1910, seated on the left. But some of his images are just strikingly clear, of the baseball players there and kind of capturing the look. He was a proofreader, and they sent him out to take photographs. And his primary job wasn't photographer, but he did only baseball, and he did it through the 1940s, took thousands of images that are out there, many of them used from baseball cards. And this, I can go through, and that print, if you see a print with that, that's his home address versus his business address. But you know me, I check the deed records and the censuses, and I can identify that he lived there, and that I can tell you what house he lived in where, and to be able to help establish the time period on that. Here's Christy Mathewson, the Christian Gentleman Hall of Fame pitcher. Was used on some tobacco, tuxedo tobacco advertising, but just the stark, the razor-sharp clarity, the expression. He got to know these players because he was there so often in New York. If you think about it, he was based in New York, and there was the Brooklyn and then the two New York, so he had 3 different stadiums, both leagues coming through. So that's another little anomaly of deadball baseball is a lot of the photographs are in New York or Chicago, the major cities where the photographers were. You'll see some from others, but most of them were there where the players rotated through. He also took what is perhaps the most famous baseball photograph of all time. This is circa 1910 with Ty Cobb sliding into the bag at third base. See the dirt flying, see the grimace on it, see him coming in with the spikes, trying to take out the player. And they actually let photographers on the field at this point in time. They banned it shortly thereafter, and they had to go to longer lenses. But Conlon was standing here, and he actually got bowled over by this slide. And he didn't know he had the shot till he got in the darkroom, that he had clicked it before everything got knocked over. So a very fortuitous turn of event. But just the action and, just a classic image. Paul Thompson, a lot of people think this guy, and it kind of cracks me up that a lot of the auction sites say, oh, the famous photographer Paul Thompson and the artistry that he exhibits, because it says photo by Paul Thompson. But I did all the research and dug in, and I can tell you he's not a photographer. He is like Bain. He is a agency owner of, and he had hire fleets of photographers. And his agency was innovative in that they were some of the first to take on-the-field portraits. And this is an example right here that was used for a baseball card and was used for the 1911 Spalding Guide. And that really sparked Conlon and a lot of the other guys to start taking portraits on the field, that's what would sell for the guides, to put the headshots in there. So in a way, that was kind of the creation in part of the headshot that we all still see and is so pervasive today, started with baseball for baseball magazines. He didn't start till 1908, but a lot of his photos, like of Mordecai Three Finger Brown, are from 1905. And so you will see photographs that has the real photographer on there and then his stamp of photo by Paul Thompson over it. But, we now know the story that he was passing it off as his when in fact he was just a distributor of the photo. But also the artistry. I mean, look at the heathering and look at the hand grip. Very artistic photo that you just don't expect to see from that time period. Another of the famous kind of masters of the early photographers was Louis Van Owen. And a quite dapper man in older age, the scarf, that. He also took a lot of great action shots. Kind of his heyday, he worked into the 30s, but I consider his finest work to be in the 1900s. This is circa 1911 of Chief Myers on the field in Pittsburgh. He also was the official photographer for the World Series in those early years, and he actually had a penchant for signing his photographs. And this is actually at the Pittsburgh in the World Series, Hall of Famer Ty Cobb, Hall of Famer Sam Crawford, and Davy Jones. And he would take the photo in October in Pittsburgh, and the next spring, when the Tigers came through Cleveland, which was his home base, he gave the photo, and he gave it compliments of Van. He's dated it on the back and dated it there, so he would have given it to one of those 3 players when they came back through in Cleveland. Maybe Ty Cobb, who knows? This is also one of his photographs, and in 1911 was widely considered what is the first informal all-star game. There's a pitcher, Hall of Famer Addie Joss, who died of tuberculosis in 1911, and they did a benefit game for the American League that all the American League players came into town to be able to play the hometown Cleveland team for a benefit game for his family. And if you notice, that has Gabby Street, Baker, Wood, but it doesn't have anything on Walter Johnson. That's because Van Hoen gave this to Johnson because this was in Johnson's scrapbook, and the reason his name's not on there is he knew who he was. He didn't have to write his name on it. So that's Walter Johnson's handwriting identifying those other three players on there. And if you looked at the back, you can see where it's been peeled out of the scrapbook. A few of the more minor photographers, but that had a huge impact on photography. One is John C. Hemmett, who was based out of Freelance out of New York. And that is a picture of Christy Mathewson at a circa 1903 at the ballpark at the Polo Grounds in New York. And once again, contrast that to the studio photographs. Now, what Hemmett was really an innovator in the technology. He built his own cameras, and he built a dual lens one, and he is actually the father of the photo finish. He was the one that created it. His first love and most of his photographs were in horse racing. He developed a photo finish by being able to simultaneously snap almost, he called it instantaneous photography. But he would do that in at Keeneland, his collections at Keeneland, and you can see his images there. But just to give you an idea of how that translates to baseball, that is just, he took this series of 4 photographs, all in 1903. The one you saw before is the second one there, but this is actually from his studio scrapbook, and you can see his labels that he's put the numbers down for the sequence, and you can see it in order, 68, 69, 70, 71. You see, he was fascinated by the study of motion and motion photography, and this is very early for that to be a consideration for photographers. Another one that is, I think, is fascinating, and I think his slogan was something along the lines that the hitherto impossible made possible. And this is a vista that he took of the 1904 in Boston and the Huntington Grounds game. So, remarkable photo in and of itself. But this is how he would take it. He had a huge camera up on a stand, perched in the outfield out there. And, he also took, like this was trying to catch a train, and that's Lawrence. But look at the sheer size. That's not a fake photograph. That is actually the camera that he was using at that point in time. He was also the first drone photographer. He started out by making balloons, and you can see it says George Lawrence, photographer, Chicago, USA. They would go up and take photographs of stadiums and other events. I think he finally figured out that wasn't quite as safe as what he thought. So what he did is he attached his camera to a series of up to 19 kites, and he would fly the kites with a camera and get shots. I don't have it here, but he took a photo of the 1906 earthquake in San Francisco that's really up high, and you wonder how in the world in 1906 did they get that? He got it through flying kites with a camera up there. So first drone photographer, if you will. There were also, as I mentioned, most of these photographers were anonymous and worked for photographic agencies. For example, this is Underwood and Underwood, and a picture of Home Run Baker, and it's just, to me, it's the quintessential photo of the Deadball Era. The upturned collar, that bat weighed 52 ounces. And if you're a baseball player now, you know that a mid-30s bat would be a very heavy bat for a batter now, but that was a club, and he was called Home Run Baker because he had 11 home runs, including a couple in the World Series. So that was kind of what he made his fame for. Another example is the American Press Association, and if you look at the cover of the book, a lot of people ask me, Jim, did you Photoshop and create that cover? And the answer is, no, I didn't. Here's the original photo that was taken. And this is what they call a composite photo. And here's where it was actually published in 1915 in the Police Gazette saying, prying the lid off the baseball season. And it had all the players from the American, Federal, and National League that it appeared in. And that backdrop is actually, I can prove to you, it's the 1912, the last game of the World Series at Fenway. And so what they would actually do, and I'll show you a closer up picture, is they would take that original 1912 photo. In the American Press Association, I've seen individual photos of a lot of these marked by the American Press Association. So what they would do is die cut those out, glue them on the other picture, then an artist would draw in the baseball. as you can tell, kind of the little jagged edges there. And then what they would do is they would take that, put it on a vertical board, mount the camera on a thing that they could ratchet up to the size of the photo, and then they took that photo. And that's the photo that you see. So it's a composite. It's an original in the sense of what it's photographing, but it's a composite in that you have multiple photographs all piled onto one another to create the new. So this was Photoshop before Photoshop. So I didn't create that. I mean, I cropped it to get it tight for the cover, but that's the image that I used. And a lot of the famous Hall of Famers that are on there. Here's another just classic photo. Have you ever heard the word scraparium? I suppose that's where the Detroit News put their photographs and retired them after they had been used, but that stamp's on the back of the photo. But here is the Detroit and Chicago catchers at the Detroit Park in the 1910s with the ladder behind them, the old piping, the tobacco sign, the nonchalance, kind of staring at you like the photographer, like you're intruding on their personal time. Another thing is I showed you the Babe Ruth. This is another example of a real photo postcard. At the same time that there was a professional photography revolution, if you think of like the Kodak brownies, the personal photography by the man in the stands and the man in the field was also a big thing. And this is Jack Chesbrough, who won 40 games in 1904. This is him at the end of the season barnstorming. As a young man, he was an orderly in a mental insane asylum. And they had an alumni team, so he went back as a ringer to pitch for the asylum team against a group of Cuban ex-Giants, which were Cuban black players that were touring the United States, including some Hall of Famers there. So a famous matchup. But this is just, with him, that he's actually playing in his New York, uniform there. Another real photo postcard that was taken by a professional photographer. He took a series in 1908, A.J. Schumann. This is the West Side grounds in Chicago, and you can see it says Chicago National League Baseball, and they actually took that over to Wrigley Field. But also you can notice the statuary and the ticket office, and in 1908 they had just built the ticket office, and the Cubs started using Cubs as their name instead of Orphans at that point in time. And you can see the two Cubs holding up the bay window there, posing, but just the amazing photograph kind of capturing that era. One of my favorites, that I always like to collect photos for the majors with a Texas connection. Here is a great example of that. This is Baker and Christy Mathewson, and it was actually taken in Galveston, Texas in the spring of 1912 when they both came through to play the local Galveston Sand Crabs. And if you look closely, you can see kind of sand, in the grass right there on the stadium. And it was taken by Lee Stoppel, and he says, the one, only, and original Christy Mathewson, the peer of all baseball pitchers. Photo at Galveston, Texas, March 16th, 1912 by Lee Stoppel. And the interesting thing, too, as well, is when I had published this and sent it out, people doing research, actually Stoppel's family contacted me, and they had no idea that he had done baseball photography at the time. So I was able to provide them with copies, but it's always interesting to kind of see the family connection of someone discovering what their father had done. Also, stadium photographs are a big deal. This is a Bain service of Fenway in 1912. If you were able to look closely, you can see the little steel caging around the baby fledgling trees that they had just planted. So this was the first year of Fenway with the facade that you still would recognize today if you went to Fenway. So, moving into the local, how many of you knew that the major leagues were in Waxahachie? Most of you. That it's a fascinating story. The major leagues were here from 1916, 17, and 18 for the Detroit Tigers, 1919 for the Cincinnati Reds in the year they won the World Championship, and in 1921 the Chicago White Sox, right after the Black Sox scandal in the World Series. But a predecessor to the Chamber of Commerce went out and solicited the Detroit Tigers to come down to Waxahachie. And this is in February before they came down in 1916. This is a page from the Detroit Free Press, and it says, this may look like New York or Paris, but it's just a sample of Waxahachie, Texas. And it's got the new Sims Library, the courthouse, and the cotton mill. But, can you imagine we don't get that kind of press today in the Detroit Free Press of a full page comparing us to New York or Paris. So that was kind of fascinating of how they did that. And they did, what they did is they tempted them to come in because of several things. Spring training was in Texas from the early 1900s into the 1920s before it petered out, and Florida became the dominant spring training site at that point in time. But there were several reasons for that. One, there was actually good train service to Texas. You could get here from most of the cities fairly easily. We had relatively good weather in March compared to up north. Another factor was we were dry. The players may not like it, but the owners wanted the place where their players could come dry out and get in spring training shape. And another factor in particular for Waxahachie was the Rogers Hotel was built in 1912, just a few years before. And so what they did is, you've probably heard stories, but they built for the Tigers that swimming pool in the basement of the Rogers Hotel and pumped over the water from hot springs wells, over there, and they put a locker room down there for the Tigers. And they would just be able to walk down the railroad tracks to the stadium. And this, as you can see, and I think they're hopefully going to restore that soon, but just look at the garden on top there. And this is actually a photo, postcard of the era of what it would have looked like at that time on Rogers Hotel. And this is actually in the museum's collection, but this is a photograph, and you can see that wing wall that you see there of the Detroit Tigers players actually standing on top of the Rogers Hotel at that point in time in their street clothes. When they would have arrived, from Detroit by train, MKT Depot, the Hot Springs Wells, which was down in that area where the city water department is now, in that general area, and they would just pipe over the water for the Rogers Hotel and the swimming pool. And they played at what we know as Richards Park. They called it Jungle Park. Anybody care to guess why they called it Jungle Park?
Because of the tigers.
Where do the tigers live? They live in the jungle. So it was an ingenious bit of marketing to tempt them here. Look, we'll call the ballpark, for your team's name. And this is from a period of, those are Tigers players, and that's probably a well-known image that most people had probably seen if you were familiar with baseball here. But very distinctive grandstand, that up there. You notice that white background right there. Those are all important. I've managed to acquire probably a dozen photos of spring training in Waxahachie that I'll show you, but I was able to photo match a lot of these by looking at the stadium features. I'm the geek that knows all the uniforms. I can tell you, okay, that uniform is that particular year, only worn that year, so that if I see that uniform, I know it's either that year or spring training the next. So you can identify and you can cross-reference the players of when they were here. For example, this was, the spring training 1918. They had the flag, for World War I. That's Hall of Fame manager Huey Jennings that is sitting on the bench in the dugout there in Richards Park. And these are glass plate negatives of the Tigers players in 1918, training. A lot of those guys went off the war, and they're doing calisthenics and being trained, as part of it by the military officers. So that's also, I can tell by that uniform type that is, taken here and looking at the fencing there. But what amazed me more than anything was my white whale was finding images of Ty Cobb at Waxahachie. I knew he had been here, and I knew there was only 1 year that he was actually here. He held out and didn't come to spring training, just like the prima donnas of the modern era. He didn't really want to come to spring training, but he did come down to Waxahachie. And that's actually, if you look, you can tell, you can match it to the stadium and the uniform, 2 images of Ty Cobb warming up and stretching in Waxahachie. This is also, you can tell better, you can see the polling up there, this one you can clearly see the match to the stadium. And that's Ty Cobb in the center, Sam Crawford, Harry Heilman on the left. All 3 of those are Hall of Famers. Bobby Veach, who is a star outfielder, and I forget his name, Burns, that was a MVP years later. Here is Bobby Veach, and this is, do you remember I showed you that white piece? That's that white piece that is back there, and you can photo match, by looking at that, you can clearly tell that was Jungle Park or Richards Park, and you also know by the flag that the year it was 1918, which is when they were here. So, you can definitively say that's Waxahachie of him batting, running. This is probably one of my favorite images because this is Hall of Famer It's a trifecta. It's a Hall of Famer. It's Eddie Collins, Hall of Fame second baseman, standing on the field in Richards Park. And what is that? That's the courthouse. So none of these photos were identified as Waxahachie, but that's a one-year uniform, 1921, for the White Sox with Collins. In 21, they were here. The fence looks alike with the dead ringer was when I noticed this courthouse spire that, that was definitively Waxahachie at that point in time. So that's actually a glass plate negative, a lantern slide. But this is the back cover of the book that has the four main photographers, Conlon, Burke, Van Owen, and Horner. But like I say, I'm just fascinated by this time period because of all the innovations and all the changes. I just see it's such a formative time and so many of the photographers. And what's probably the challenge of this book was there's lots of baseball books out there, but no one had ever written a book that focused on the kind of unknown and underappreciated photographers. Plenty of books on Ty Cobb, plenty of books on the World Series, but no one had really kind of tackled. And for the hobby, a lot of this is groundbreaking stuff that people just don't know. And if you read the book, it's in snippets, so you can read a chapter here or there, or 5 or 8 pages if you want. But it delves into incredible detail to prove out a lot of the things that I've said. So it's been very well received in the collecting world, and I hope a crossover audience of people that just enjoy baseball or local history. And I appreciate all of you coming out tonight. Many of you have bought books. If you're interested, I'm happy to sign one for you. And I'm happy also, if you have any questions at this point in time, I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
How much time do you have in putting this book together? How many years?
People who work with me know I work fast. That's 1 year from start to finish.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, I've collected for 10 years, but from actual conceptualizing and saying I want to write a book to producing that, a year. I have a very forgiving wife.
Is Waxahachie stuff in there?
Yes, it is. At the very end of the book, if you flip back there, the story of spring training and some of those photos are actually in the book.
That picture you have of Jack Chesbrough,
Yes.
is that an only one? It's 1905?
Yes, that's the only one that is known to exist. I also have one of his team, and I know others exist, of the Cuban X.
He lived in the town my grandfather lived in, Massachusetts.
Oh.
My grandfather used to talk about Jack Chesbrough. That's the only picture. I've never seen a picture of him. He used to talk about it.
There are, I have, they're few and far between. They're out there. Yes. Yeah. All right. Any other questions? If not, thank you very much. Appreciate it.